It's good to be back among you. Such good friends. Last week we celebrated Memorial Day, and in a few weeks we'll be celebrating the 4th of July, our independence. And both of these holidays, as well as many other of our national holidays, involves prayers and rituals for our country and for those who died defending our country. From our founding, religion has been intertwined with patriotic events, which in some ways is ironic since we were the first nation in the Western world to separate church and state and establish our nation based on secular reasoning and ethics. The great irony is that more than in any other Western nation, religion has continued to be part of our national public character and is part of many of our public events, including government meetings. Congress, from the beginning, has had paid chaplains. The Supreme Court starts every one of its sessions with "God bless this court." We have "In God We Trust" on our money. We have "One Nation Under God" that has been part of our Pledge of Allegiance to the flag since 1954. And every presidential inauguration involves swearing on a Bible. And every major presidential speech, as we know, always invokes God to bless our country. We do not have a church or a religion that is officially supported by government, because that's what separation of church and state requires. But religious symbols and rituals have permeated our culture as a people. Part of this is due to what Alexis de Tocqueville, the French traveler in the United States in the 1830s, saw as a result of separating churches from government. It gave churches and other religious communities the freedom and the necessity to compete independently and privately for support, and this led to the growth of religion. But the second reason is that the first settlers who came to this country in the 17th century, the Puritans, believed that they were making a new covenant with God. They were going to create, as they said, a new Israel that would fulfill the promise made to Abraham in the Bible, that he would be the father of a people who would be a light to the nations. That's in Genesis chapter 12, as you know. These pilgrims, even before they got off the Mayflower ship, signed a compact, the Mayflower Compact, wherein they committed themselves to found a nation based on Christian principles and to create a country that would be what they called the city on a hill, radiating the light of religious and moral truth to all nations of the world. They felt that the new society that they were creating here was a blessing from God imbued with sacred character. De Tocqueville himself was convinced that 200 years after this new covenant on the Mayflower, that the ethic of the Puritans had really permeated not just New England, but had permeated all the colonies by the 1830s. And that most Americans, by that time, really did believe that we were an exceptional country among the nations and had a mission from God to show the world how to be right with God. So despite the impact of the First Amendment to the Constitution that took government out of supporting religious institutions, religion flourished in this land. But the type of public religion that has evolved in our country is not linked with any doctrine or particular church or spiritual tradition. Public religion has morphed into a generic kind of belief in a deity who is all-powerful and benevolent, who has a moral law embedded in the conscience of every human being. This God had blessed this nation with land and abundance and guided its founders to establish a democratic government in which political and religious freedom was guaranteed for all. This was what made America exceptional, according to our founders. It had been ordained by divine providence to show humankind a better way. Hence, its people were truly chosen for a mission, much like the Israelites of old. Now, in the 1960s, the sociologist Robert Bellah, who just died recently, picked up on what de Tocqueville had sensed a century before, and he called this pervasive religious phenomenon civil religion. He explained that it served two roles in American culture: the priestly function and the prophetic function. The priestly function, he said, served to legitimate patriotism with a sacred character. Allegiance to the nation had a sacred character to it, since God was deeply involved in protecting and promoting the American experiment. One's commitment to the nation and its goals was really part of one's religious obligation. The mixture of religion and patriotism has given a deeper dimension to service to our country and its ideals, especially during wartime, and has given stronger motivation to soldiers to make the ultimate sacrifice. American wars have been seen as part of God's will to establish and preserve democracy for ourselves and later for others who were threatened by tyranny. That is why in times of war, religious hymns such as the Battle Hymn of the Republic, God Bless America, became so popular. The latter hymn, God Bless America, we have been asked to sing so many times since 9/11 at public events like sports. The problem, however, with the priestly function of civil religion, which Bella was quick to point out, was that it sometimes, not always, sometimes, it can stimulate a kind of self-righteousness and moral rigidity that makes it hard for Americans to view ourselves and other nations objectively. We often tend to stereotype our enemies, both in cold and in hot wars, as embodiments of evil, and see ourselves as crusaders for morality. And this sometimes makes an accurate political analysis of very complex international affairs difficult to achieve. Choosing lesser evils or making necessary compromises with other nations whose ideals are different from ours in order to preserve peace are sometimes seen as selling out to immorality and evil. This also makes it hard for us citizens and policymakers to engage in criticism of our own national policies that have times gone astray or caused harm to ourselves or other nations. I remember during the Vietnam War hearing from the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, "My country, right or wrong?" But sometimes this can lead to a blind support for war and for other policies. We think of the Vietnam War, we think of the wrong-headed invasion of Iraq. So this kind of religious patriotism that becomes rigid and narrow can become, in religious terms, a form of idolatry. It conveniently ignores the moral law of the God to whom civil religion is supposed to obey and substitutes worship of the nation itself. That's a false God. That's why the second function of civil religion, according to Bella, the prophetic function, must always be cultivated as a counterbalance to the priestly dimension if true patriotism is to thrive. The prophetic function is the critical function. It is the willingness to judge the actions of ourselves and our government, of our culture, on the basis of moral ideals of freedom and law-abidingness to which we are committed, and to call the country to task when we fail to live up to those goals. The Puritans themselves always reminded themselves, despite that they believed we were a city on the hill, that we were also fragile people. We can make mistakes. And so we need to repent in order to continue to realize the ideals we profess. Abraham Lincoln really had a sense of this twofold nature of civil religion, the priestly and the prophetic. He viewed the Declaration of Independence as a gift from God, the last, best hope of earth, he called it. He believed that the blood that was shed at Gettysburg sanctified in some way the soil there, and viewed the battle as part of a higher struggle for freedom demanded by God. He was, however, unabashedly clear about the nation's failings that brought about the Civil War, chiding both the North and the South in his second inaugural. Lincoln blamed both the South, who owned slaves, and the North, who long acquiesced to slavery, as under the judgment of God. And he viewed the Civil War as a punishment by God on both sides for having failed to live up to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Interestingly enough, many of the clergy of Lincoln's day, along with soldiers on both sides, were certain that God supported only their cause and hated the enemy on the other side. Lincoln, however, not much of a church-going man, had a better sense of divine purpose. He said, God gives to both the North and the South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. In his second inaugural in 1864, he rejected the religious jingoism on both sides used to cover up their respective failures. He called upon the North and the South to accept their punishment and then to rededicate themselves together to the principles of the Declaration of Independence as God's abiding command to the United States. A very balanced assessment at the end of that war. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s also had a sense of the prophetic function of religion in his preaching when he reminded Americans that we have dual obligations, and these were his words. You have a dual citizenry. You live both in time and in eternity. Your highest loyalty is to God and not to the mores and folk ways, the state or the nation, or any human-made institution. If any earthly institution or custom conflicts with God's will, it is your Christian duty to oppose it. You must never allow the transitory, evanescent demands of human-made institutions to take precedence over the eternal demands of the Almighty God. He said this in 1963. King was well aware of the blessings shed by God on America and its sacred mission. Remember, he had a vision for all of us that was very hopeful. But he was also honest in reminding us all that when we failed to live up to the promise of our Declaration of Independence and Constitution, especially in terms of racial equality and justice, we needed to be called to task so that we could do better, not that we would despair. So he understood very well the dimensions of the civil religion in our country. Both these great Americans, Lincoln, King, accepted the power of civil religion, but applied it fully to the moral challenges of their times. Neither of them fell into despair, nor gave up on the nation for its misuse of power, but neither did they idealize the wrong-headed policies of their times as divinely sanctioned. They understood the biblical roots of civil religion in seeing humans as both gifted and fragile, and in need of honest self-criticism so as to realize the ideals to which we aspire. There were many others in the 1960s and 1970s who followed King's example of calling the nation back to its ideals. Reverend William Sloane Coffin, Fathers Daniel and Philip Berrigan, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, Pastor John Newhouse, to mention only a few. All of them believed in the high moral purpose of this nation embedded in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and they were true patriots. But they also were unafraid to speak truth to power and to remind the country of its blindness in pursuing a useless war in Vietnam and continuing on a dangerous path of nuclear weapons escalation. Where are we today? Today, civil religion is still invoked, but most often in its priestly manifestation, seldom in its prophetic role by Americans' moral leaders. In the post-9/11 era, we are quick to denounce some nations as part of the axis of evil and to endow ourselves as the saviors of democracy and freedom in the world. But when a president publicly admits that we have failed in some of our policies towards our Muslim neighbor nations, he is lampooned for being anti-American. Moral dissent is being stifled in the wake of a supranationalism that has emerged over the past decade and a half, and often clergy are silent in addressing some of the pressing moral issues of our day. The growing gap between rich and poor that is causing human suffering in our land, the insensitivity to the plight of undocumented aliens in our country doing backbreaking work for us at pittance salaries, the gross neglect of our environment that is poisoning us all, the unquestioned use of new faceless technology to kill in the war on terror, the expanding use of government surveillance on us, the uncontrolled sale of guns to practically anyone who wants to buy them, and the unfinished agenda of racial justice. I don't think these public moral failures in our time are any less serious than the issues that Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. and their fellow clergy 50 years ago faced. But our moral leaders seem to be afraid to address them honestly, publicly, forthrightly. I admit I'm a child of the 60s. I don't apologize for that. My heroes are King, Coffin, the Berrigans, and others. I find myself very much alone whenever I try to raise issues of social justice in sermons or other public talks, except in places like this. I don't dare to do this in some churches. Recently, and Jim was there, I was asked by the Ripon Area Ministerial Association to give the main address at its first community-wide prayer breakfast in Ripon on May 1st. As you may know, the first Thursday in May has been designated as a National Day of Prayer for the country, first approved by Congress and President Truman in 1952, and subsequently reaffirmed by several Congresses and presidents since then. It is to be a day when Americans of different faiths are to pray together for the country and its current needs, asking God continuing favor on our endeavors. In my remarks on May 1st, I tried to hit a balance with the two functions of civil religion, priestly and prophetic. I asked all in attendance to pray to God in thanksgiving for the many blessings God has endowed on our country over the years, and for all the dedicated civil servants in our nation at the national, state, and local levels with whom God has blessed us. I acknowledge that some of those officials were present at the breakfast and asked for everyone to give a round of applause to the police, to the firemen, to the teachers, to the veterans. And those in attendance did very willingly. Then I moved to the second part of civil religion. And I said some words of self-criticism that we as a nation, I thought, needed to hear. And this is what I said. We are at a critical time in our history. Never before in my adult life can I recall when we've been so divided. Our public servants are vilified, and character assassination has become more common than respectful dissent. Political parties are deadlocked over ideological battles rather than seeking compromises that in the past have served us so well. Those with enormous sums of money have come to have special access to government, so that it is hard for elected officials to avoid their offers to bankroll election campaigns that are now astronomically expensive. Technology has placed information, and instant analysis is literally at our fingertips. But blogs, cable news networks, syndicated radio commentators have exploited our emotions of fear and sometimes hatred, so as to make it hard to inform ourselves with objective information about public policy. As a result, words like liberal, conservative, taxes, government have become dirty words instead of descriptive adjectives and nouns for important ideas, policies, and institutions in our society. The gap between those with enormous wealth and the rest of us has widened steadily in the past several decades, and the aggravation of suffering among those in the middle and bottom of our society has grown steadily. Homelessness, hunger, poverty, drug addiction are rampant, along with the trafficking of human beings as close to us as in Milwaukee, and child pornography rings in the Fox Valley. We've grown weary over the past decade and a half with wars that have drained our treasures and our blood, but so many in the world still need our help that we cannot retreat to isolationism. The challenge is to find ways together as a nation to promote justice, peace, environmental protection around the globe in effective ways that do not rely only on military intervention, nor alienate those beyond our shores for seemingly being imperialistic or bent on getting access to their precious resources. And then I concluded with this. I said, some may feel that a National Day of Prayer should avoid politics, but political issues have moral dimensions that cannot be avoided. People who profess to be religious cannot avoid addressing these issues and making them central in our prayer if the God we believe in is going to continue to bless us and work through us to make his presence felt in our world, here and abroad. Now, there was applause. But only one pastor at the gathering came up to me afterwards to thank me at the end of the breakfast. And you guess who it might be? Jim. At the next meeting of the Ministerial Association a week later, which I attended, nothing was mentioned about my remarks. One minister quietly leaned over and thanked me, probably not heard by the rest of them. The clergy member who organized the event and invited me to do the presentation has not spoken a word to me since. Now, I don't hold myself up as prophet, and I don't let the silence discourage me. I've learned to adjust to a very different religious context in this country than when I was an active member of the clergy in the 1970s. I also found out some sobering news from a research project one of my students did 2 summers ago in the Ripon area, when she interviewed all the active members of the clergy in Ripon about when and if they preach on issues of social justice. Other than the president of the Unitarian Fellowship, Gene Johnson, whom you probably know, this student found that all the other pastors representing 9 Christian denominations held the position that preaching about social justice, poverty, war, the environment, was political, and that they always avoided politics in sermons. Moreover, several of them said the Bible does not speak to such issues. They did admit to the student, however, that they had no problem preaching against abortion and gay marriage, since these were against God's laws. So I'm not surprised that half of civil religion, the prophetic function, has fallen by the wayside in our time. But I am saddened. Now, as much as in the past, perhaps more so in some critical areas, we as a people need to be reminded of our current moral myopia, fixated sometimes on private, personal morality, and called to meet our public ethical responsibilities more honestly and courageously. We need to be told at times, in the words of the famous children's story, that the emperor has no clothes. And that in a democracy, we the people are also partly responsible for the emperor's nakedness. Why is it that a 77-year-old man who wears a white dress and serves as a leader of a 2,000-year-old institution has caught the imagination and conscience of the world? I think it's for 2 reasons. The silence by other moral leaders of our time is deafening, and humans are hungry for inspiration. And the second reason is that Jorge Mario Bergoglio speaks the truth to power honestly and consistently, and has stirred the conscience of many in our world as to our need to address the sufferings of the vast majority of people on our globe and the terrible scourges of war and weaponry that threaten human life. We need more like Francis. And we especially need the Francises at the seat of global power, right here in our own country. As the wonderful hymn, America the Beautiful, says, America, America, God has shed his grace on thee, till selfish gain no longer stain the banner of the free. So what do you think?